Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh Science Festival. Following on from the UN's declaration of a decade of ecosystem restoration, today we join our panel for an exploration of what we need to do to save the planet. Marshalling experience from UK rewilding and reforestation, we'll explore a variety of initiatives. This decade is going to be the most important yet for our fight to restore our wild spaces and slow the alarming decline of non-human animal populations globally. What can we all do locally, nationally and internationally to help? This event is free for you to enjoy thanks to our festival sponsors and supporters. Edinburgh Science is an educational charity. Please consider making a donation through our website to support the work we do and enjoy the event.
Hello and welcome to this conversation about rewilding. My name's Kevin Keane and I'm BBC Scotland's Environment and Rural Affairs correspondent. Now, there's no doubt that nature is in decline. We're seeing species disappearing at an alarming rate, and that's something that should concern all of us. The reasons for it are complex. It's partly to do with climate change, but also to do with species loss as well and habitat loss, both here at home and, of course, across the planet. And that's where rewilding can come in. We're already on a rewilding journey here in Scotland. We've seen the reintroduction of sea eagles and beavers. We're also seeing habitats being restored in the marine environment for things like oysters. And of course, there's an active conversation ongoing about the role of big predators like wolves and the Eurasian lynx. But of course, amid all of that, the question is whether or not we've managed to restore a new order to our nature and whether that's even possible or desirable. And we've got a panel of 3 experts to discuss all of that. So I'll let you introduce yourselves.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. I'm Bernadette Butfield. I'm the Marine Policy Officer for the Scottish Wildlife Trust.
Good afternoon, my name is Peter Cairns. I'm Executive Director of rewilding charity Scotland, The Big Picture.
Hello, my name is Feline Zu-Amgassen and I'm with the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance and the University of Edinburgh.
Okay, so we'll start off with a big broad question, which is how you perceive or see or envision rewilding and what it actually means to you. So we'll start with you, Bernadette.
So rewilding, from my perspective, is all about the marine environment, being a marine policy officer. And it is quite different, or in some respects, to the terrestrial environment, but I'll let Pete refer to that in a bit. So it can go one or two ways. So we look at restoring proactively habitats in the marine environment to bring them up to a really healthy state where they can continue to deliver their natural benefits back to society. Also removing pressures from those habitats as well is really important in the marine environment. So those are kind of ways that we can look at rewilding in the marine environment.
And how necessary is it in the marine environment? I mean, we're aware because we can see just how much the landscape has changed because of man-made interaction and intervention. What about in the marine world?
I mean, it's extremely important in the marine environment. We're very well aware of all the problems that we're facing currently with the health, climate and ecological emergencies that we are currently facing right now. And the ocean is at the front line of those emergencies. We're aware that the ocean absorbs or has absorbed over 90% of human carbon emissions, and annually is estimated to absorb around 25 to 30% of emissions every year as well. So it's a really, really key, important player in tackling climate change and loss of biodiversity, is protecting and focusing on the marine environment.
And Feline, do you agree with that? And because obviously the marine environment's your specialism as well, and also, do you think it's getting the attention that perhaps the rewilding of land seems to be getting a lot of at the moment?
I completely agree that it's really important to start thinking about the marine environment as a series of habitats that are all interconnected, and that has been missing from a lot of the conversation previously about marine conservation in general. I think the marine environment rarely gets the attention that it deserves relative to terrestrial environments, and in particular when we're thinking about habitats that really are hard to visualize, such as those in the subtidal areas around the kind of cold often not particularly clear waters of the United Kingdom, it can be really hard to access those for people and to understand just how degraded they have been through our direct impacts.
Pete, obviously your area of work's hogging all the attention then. Is that, does that mean we're well on the journey in terms of rewilding of the land, or are we still quite at early stages?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, as you describe it, it is a process, it is a journey. And if you look at some of the really high profile rewilding or nature recovery projects that are emerging in Scotland, they're right at the beginning of that journey. You know, some of them have 200-year visions. So we're really at the, maybe not the embryonic stage, but we're certainly at the infancy stage of rewilding in Scotland. I think that there are two sort of parallel avenues, if you like. There's the physical work, there's physical change on the ground, and that is accelerating with habitat restoration, with species reintroduction, as you alluded to. There's also a sort of a philosophical shift in perspective and mindset that's also required. We need to reimagine our whole relationship with nature, and I think that's more fragile, that's more at a fledgling stage at this stage. So a lot of what I do is focused not so much on habitats and species, but actually on people and their perceptions, attitudes and values.
Because of course the majority of the population in Scotland live in urban environments. Is it those people that you have to pitch it towards rather than people in rural settings who perhaps are already sold on much of this idea?
Yeah, if I'm honest, I'm always kind of reluctant to silo individual groups, urban, rural, town, country, whatever, because I think, you know, there's a spectrum of opinion and perspectives across every group, including perhaps what you might perceive to be some of the more sort of entrenched detractors of rewilding, the farming community, the gamekeeping community, for example. And there are detractors in those communities, there's no doubt about that. But there are also supporters, and there are also people that are curious about what it might mean for them personally, for them as a group, and more widely at a societal level. So I think there's a range of perspectives and opinion, and it's quite fluid, it's changing all the time as we become better informed, and these types of conversations take place. So it's a constantly evolving process, but I'm reluctant to say, you know, X group of people think this and Y group of people think that, because that's not my experience.
Bernadette, is it more straightforward in the marine world where people perhaps have slightly less entrenched views about how, for example, the land should be used, or do you encounter your own difficulties?
Absolutely, it's not straightforward at all. And as mentioned earlier, it's even more difficult to envision what is going on in the marine environment for many people, and it really is important not to silo because everything is connected. So the land is connected completely to the marine environment as well. So just because you're in an urban setting that is really far away from the coast doesn't mean that you're directly having an impact on the coast as well. So it's really important to bring everybody along in that conversation and make sure that everyone's aware of what's going on out there as well. So yeah, we definitely come across a lot of challenges. And another thing with the marine environment is there's lots of overlap with activities, which makes it really difficult to manage that environment. And there's lots of stakeholders who are party to those areas. So we definitely get a lot of pushback when trying to manage and balance out all of those activities alongside conserving the environment as well.
Feline, principally, I guess, the most important or significant of those stakeholders is the fishing community. How difficult a balancing act is it to get right with the demands of people who want to fish the seas and people like yourself who want to principally conserve them?
Well, fundamentally, I think those 2 points of view don't have to and often aren't opposed to one another at all. I mean, when we're thinking about rewilding or restoration in the marine environment, we are thinking about getting back the health of the system that has been lost and degraded through time. And it's not really, while we can learn from the past, it's not very helpful to have a situation where we're pointing fingers and thinking about historical threats. It's much more constructive to think about where we are now, where we'd like to communally get to in the future, and then how we can collaborate to achieve those goals. And in particular with oyster restoration, where really, you know, in the 18th century and in 19th centuries, the major declines were as a result of fishing. The fishermen today are often the strongest supporters of bringing back the native oyster to our waterways. And it's their knowledge and enthusiasm that's pushed a lot of projects forwards.
What about the speed that it's happening, Feline? Is that, you mentioned some of the oyster restoration projects there, and that's happening in small numbers around the coast. Is it happening quickly enough, or Could it happen at a faster rate if more money was pumped into it, for example?
Things can always happen faster when money is pumped in. I would say it is happening at a really astoundingly encouraging and fast rate at the moment. With oyster restoration, we're still at the point where we're learning a lot about the best ways to do it, and importantly, also how to engage with our stakeholders in moving these projects forward. And that's always a process that takes time. So while more money in the long term is absolutely essential to see these visions come to fruition, because it's an incredibly expensive form of restoration, the timeline itself is not problematic. It takes a long time to grow an oyster, and it takes a long time to work with statutory bodies and local stakeholders to gain that community understanding and support that really allows these projects to flourish indefinitely into the future.
Bernadette, when you create something like that, an oyster reef, are you creating something that stands alone, or is it important that it's actually forming part of the wider ecosystem?
It's extremely important that it forms a wider part of that ecosystem. And here in Scotland, we really focus on feature-based protection, and that's something we kind of need to shift away from and focus on whole sites and the wider ecosystem benefits that we can gain from protecting an entire ecosystem, rather than just focusing on particular species or particular habitats. So yes, it's extremely important to consider the wider benefits that we can gain there. But there are some species like oysters that are key species, and they can then provide the foundational supports to provide stronger ecosystems in particular areas. So there is benefit to focusing on some of those species within that, but we definitely need to encourage a wider focus in all of that as well.
Pete, on the land, when you talk about species being reintroduced, it can be quite controversial, and people tend to think of things like wolves and lynx, but there's a lot more to it than that, isn't there? I mean, things like wildcats, other species as well. How important is that in the wider plan to rewild part of Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, I think reintroductions tend to hog the headlines for obvious reasons. But I agree with Bernadette. If you think about it, conservationists have spent the last 30, 40, 50 years trying to save nature piece by piece, species by species, fragments of habitat. And we're now starting to be much more ecologically aware and looking at the big picture, the landscape scale, ecosystem scale. But nevertheless, within that, if you draw an analogy with an ecosystem being a car engine, for example, we've gradually removed components of that engine. And of course, what happens is that engine starts to splutter. Ultimately, if we remove all the components, it will stop. So to enable the engine, the ecological engine, to function more effectively, we have to put some of those components back. Those components can be the large predators, wolves, lynx, but as you say, it comes down to other species as well, large mammals like wildcats being an example, and right down to, in the marine environment, things like oysters. So for me, it's not necessarily about picking out individual species, because they are all part of the jigsaw. It's about looking at how we really rebuild the jigsaw in the round.
And I think the thing with the oysters is that it was about building the habitat first. How much is that the case in the land, on the land? Do you build the habitat first and then introduce the species, or do you rely on their adaptability?
Well, again, I think with respect, the nature of the questions kind of underlines this mentality that we have about prescriptive management. We do this so we can achieve that, we do that so we can achieve this. I think we've got to look at system thinking, and we need to rebuild the whole. So whether it's about habitats, whether it's about natural processes, whether it's about species, or actually whether it's about the whole of that interaction and interdependency, I would argue it's about the big picture, the jigsaw, the ecological engine, and making sure that all the components are in place to allow that engine to function effectively. That's what we're missing at the moment. We're missing, for a bit of a clumsy phrase, but we're missing some ecological functionality, if you like. We have bits of the system in place, but it's not working to its optimum level, and that's what I think we're all working towards.
Feline, how do we achieve that in the marine environment then?
Through painstaking and deliberate stakeholder engagement and collaboration. I think, and this was also alluded to earlier in our conversation, that there are so many stakeholders in the marine environment. It's not a question of just finding out who owns that bit of land, so to speak, or the bottom of the sea. It's a three-dimensional system with a really complex network of users, all with different needs, and those needs do need to be met on a larger scale. It's a really fundamental part of the oceans, is this broader network of community, and really ultimately that's going to be the only way we can achieve this in the marine environment, is to work with marine spatial planning, work with all the relevant stakeholders to make sure that these long-term visions, and they really are long-term, you're not looking for a quick fix in anything with regards to rewilding. So it is about future planning and understanding how best to meet everybody's visions of the future, and to incorporate nature into being part of that, so that they can move forward together stronger.
How difficult is it to achieve all that, given in the marine environment that you can't really see that big picture that Pete talks about, because most of it's below the surface? And we often hear it described as the last wilderness, our seas and oceans. Can we get a feel for how all of these species and the wider ecosystem interacts truly in the marine environment, and perhaps the way that we might be able to be more successful on the land?
Personally, I think it's a real challenge, is the monitoring of these systems, and getting that feedback, that data, that information that we want to share with everybody about what's being achieved once restoration actions are undertaken. It's often extremely challenging and costly to bring that information to the forefront, particularly in ways that people who aren't necessarily familiar with the species or what the habitat should look like are familiar with. And I think that that's not necessarily a barrier. Again, it's just a question of time. We need to have the impetus now, the momentum now, to start these conversations. They're long-term conversations involving many people, but ultimately, I'm convinced that people understand already the kind of basic value that nature provides us. They see it on land. It's not, that value isn't different because it's under the water. The difficulty is just translating it into something that seems to be of everyday relevance. But I think we've seen in the media over the last few years that marine environments are extremely engaging. We don't have to necessarily personally be able to go out there, see them and get wet in order to really understand that we have this innate connection with the sea. And I think people ultimately want healthier coastlines and a greater biodiversity. And that's what these marine habitats are providing us with. They're providing us with ecosystem services that ultimately clean the waters and provide a greater diversity of both fish and crabs, some of which we eat, some of which we don't. But those benefits, I really think, are felt by all, even if you can't tangibly go out and grab them yourself.
I suppose one of the pressures that the lands and the seas are facing at the moment as well is how they can be used to achieve our aims to decarbonise our society as well. And we know about blue carbon, we know about the importance of trees and peatland restoration, for example. Is that an advantage, or is that something that you just have to factor into this equation?
It is completely part of it. So focusing on nature-based solutions in both the terrestrial and the marine environment isn't a panacea to solving all of our issues at all, and that should always be remembered with these. Whilst they are a great approach to help start tackling some of our problems, it's really important that we also do this alongside decarbonising the economy and our society in general, as well as reducing our emissions. So yeah, it's really important to bring that along in the conversation as well, and not allow it to get forgotten.
Blue carbon's a relatively new concept to the kind of common person as well. Do we understand enough about it at the moment to know how much carbon is stored in the marine environment and how important it is and why it's important?
There are lots of studies emerging and existing that show just how beneficial the marine environment is to storing carbon. So drawing down and storing carbon in plants, so seagrass meadows, kelp forests, and the seabed itself as well, in the sediments that are layered within there, as well as the animals, so the fish, the crustaceans and the larger mammals that are present in the marine environment. There are plenty of studies showing just how beneficial the marine environment is in terms of sequestering carbon. And we also know that some of these marine habitats are much better than their counterparts on the terrestrial environment than doing so. So it's really important that these are given more attention as the conversation develops a little bit more as well. But one challenge with that is not having some of these kind of baseline understandings of what a pristine blue carbon habitat may look like, and a marine habitat in general. So this prevents us from developing really strong management measures and is a challenge that we're going to be facing in the marine environment. Here in the UK, we only have 2 kind of monitored no-take zones at present, one being Lamlash Bay, just off the coast of Arran, and then the other in Lyme Bay down in the southwest of England. And both of these have shown the benefits that protecting these areas can provide us with in terms of coastal protection from storms and also increasing biodiversity abundance too. So we have those figures there, but we do need a larger network of these baseline areas of protection to be able to really give us a little bit more information as to what we need to do going forward as well.
But that's coming, is it, you think?
We are calling for the government to implement 30% protected areas by 2030, and within that fully protected areas of 10%. So hopefully, yes is the answer. Designated wise in the UK or in Scotland, we have over 30%. However, we don't have the management measures required to actually fully say that those are protected. So it's questionable as to whether those reach the 30 by 30 already. And we certainly don't have 10% fully protected. So we are hoping and we are calling for the government to implement those, yes. And so hopefully they will be coming soon.
Pete, on those pressures, I mentioned woodland restoration or tree planting and peatland restoration as well. Do they work hand in hand with rewilding, or again, is that a desire to manage the land in a different way for the benefit of, our carbon auditing and accounting? Is that an additional pressure on the land?
I think carbon is an evolving story. It's still a journey of discovery. We don't know definitively what each habitat will deliver in terms of carbon sequestration. I think there's also at the moment a little bit of a real hunger, if you like, to get trees in the ground. We're a little bit obsessed with trees at the moment. Nothing wrong with trees, of course, but there's a big difference, ecologically speaking, between trees and forest or woodland. One is a system, one is a specific range of plants, if you like. So again, I think carbon sequestration and its potential is huge, and it will certainly has the potential for drawing in financial resources into ecological restoration or rewilding. I think we've just got to be careful that we maintain a perspective on the wider system and don't get obsessed again with individual species or groups of species. So the potential of carbon sequestration is huge, financially as much as anything else, but we just got to be careful about how it's managed moving forward.
So how do we manage the land for the desire and the aspiration of rewilding it? Do we decide, as we are doing at the moment, that we want pockets of land to be rewilded, or does it need to be looking at much greater areas, or perhaps even all of Scotland, to create something that's a bit less piecemeal?
Yes, absolutely. We have a very much, if you look at the map, the rewilded areas, and of course how you define that depends on who you're speaking to and what your parameters are. But in general, if you look at rewilding areas, they are patchwork, they are dots on the map. And there's no doubt about it that big and joined up is better than small and fragmented, which is what we've got at the moment. So there does need to be a huge acceleration, a transformational change really, in how we look upon the landscape, not so much what it looks like, but what it can deliver. We've spoken about ecosystem services, horrible word, but there's no doubt about it that the services that the land and the sea delivers to us as a species has been historically massively undervalued, and I think our eyes are just becoming attuned to that. So yeah, there needs to be a ramping up. There needs to be greater connectivity. The direction of travel, I would say, is generally positive, but we're still really entrenched in this managing nature piece by piece, and we're still kind of obsessed with this word protection. And I think if we've discovered one thing in the last sort of 10, 15 years, protecting what we've got isn't enough. We need to look at restoration and recovery, and there's a big difference between those two approaches.
Feline, we're talking about protection there. We've got a big network of marine protected areas around the coastline of Scotland. Are they protecting the seas and the oceans effectively?
I'm not the best person to ask that question to.
Okay.
I do have a question though, following on from Pete. I'm very interested to know whether or not the existing policy framework helps or hinders the concept of rewilding at a big scale, and thinking particularly with regards to a shifted baseline and also, as was mentioned in the marine environment, not necessarily knowing what was there before. There still being some debate, and policy frameworks looking to improve from a relatively recent baseline. So does the current policy framework with regards to what we're trying to get to help or hinder rewilding efforts?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there's this general perception that rewilding is trying to create some fixed or recreate some fixed point in the past. You know, people often accuse me of trying to recreate some sort of utopian, you know, Cinderella habitat, almost a Disney-fied landscape. I don't think that's what rewilding is about. I think it's a journey, and I don't think there's any definitive point on that journey at which point we say we've arrived. I don't think there's any prescription that we can lay down and say that's what we want to get to. Ultimately, rewilding for me is about letting go. It's about handing back control to nature, letting natural processes play out. That for our cultural perspective at the moment is a really big barrier to overcome, because we become completely accustomed to controlling every square inch of the landscape. And so to relinquish some of that control back to nature and let it do its own thing with no knowledge of what that may ultimately look like or where it may take us is quite a psychological barrier for many people to overcome. So I think...
Is there a risk of that you end up with a disaster scenario because it's not ready to look after itself just yet?
Well, I think, you know, there are stages, there are habitats at various stages of restoration, and of course most of them need some human intervention to, as it were, light the blue touch paper to catalyse those natural processes. But conservation historically has always had a target in mind. We want to spend this money over this period for this result. And rewilding kind of flips that on its head. We need the money to ignite the restoration, but actually we're going to stand back and see what happens. How do we define a disaster? What does a disaster look like? You know, we've got to be prepared to take risks if our ambition for larger, better and joined up is to be realised. So I would argue that, you know, yes, some places might end up being disasters, but, you know, nature will dictate what that looks like exactly and over what time period.
Feline, I might throw that question back on you then. Do you think it's working, the policy framework?
I think it's a learning process. I think there's certainly an appetite for thinking about the marine environment in a longer term time frame, although certain policies are perhaps focused on those nearer past goals. But I think it's an ongoing conversation. I think what's really striking from what Pete was saying is, I think one thing that is similar between the two is this need for protection and thinking about habitats. It's absolutely clear that in the marine environment, the major threat to benthic habitats, to habitats that are growing on the bottom of the sea and create this three-dimensionality, be they seagrasses, be they oysters, be they marl beds, is destructive gears, destructive fishing practices. And protection has to be a part of that story. A major barrier to a lot of oyster restoration projects is being able to establish areas that are known to be protected in the future once all that effort's gone in. It's not, in the case of something like oysters or seagrasses, it's not the only thing you need, because in many cases they're so degraded that even if you just left it protected for a while, something else would come in, much as Pete said, something else will come in but you won't necessarily get oysters back, because oysters need a hard substrate to settle out on and to grow on, and that might have been fished out or covered by sediments. They also need to have a high enough density that they can breed properly. They don't move around, obviously, so they need to be quite close to their partners in order to be able to breed. And so establishing conditions that allow oysters to become reefs under protection is a really important part of native oyster restoration. And then I think where the rewilding comes in, so in my mind, that's restoration. There's leaving things alone and protecting them, then there's an active restoration process. And in terms of rewilding and thinking about things at a landscape scale, it's really then asking the question, how do these restored habitats fit into our broader, large-scale, long-term vision of what we hope to get to see established in those oceans? And that's when those habitat interactions that Bernadette was speaking about with regards to seagrasses or even salt marshes being promoted by the presence of oysters, that you start to see these synergies, these positive feedbacks between the habitats, so that you no longer need to put as much effort in to get these biodiversity, to get these ecosystem service benefits from your effort. And at the moment in the marine environment, we're still in the early stages of this. We're still quite small scale, we're still quite experimental. And that's why I'm not so worried about longer timelines. It is a learning process that can be sped up through collaboration, can be sped up through greater funding. But there are certain conditions that need to be met before we really can scale up, which would include things like habitat protection. And so it all has to be part of a longer term conversation, and then a long-term commitment by stakeholders to this joint vision.
Bernadette, is it in the marine environment, in your view, is it mostly about restoration or protection?
Yeah, so to maybe reflect on my thoughts about the policy framework that we have here for the marine environment and rewilding in that, to link in then to your conversation. I think we have a massive opportunity at the moment in Scotland for rewilding in the marine environment. But as I touched on earlier, we have to consider a lot of overlapping activities within the management of the marine environment, and that's where we face a lot of challenges there. So allowing for rewilding to take place in the marine environment has to occur through us giving protection to sites or specific areas through marine protected areas. And in those fully protected areas where no extractive activity occurs would be where rewilding in those areas could take place. And then we would go in and either allow those sites to, by removing the pressures, just allow them to restore naturally, or through proactive restoration, as Phileme was touching on as well. So here in Scotland, we have policies that are going forward. We have lots of opportunities at present to implement this, but we do need political will to do this. So I mentioned the 30 by 30 approach that we're calling for, protection of 30% of marine protected areas in Scotland. And while we have those sites designated of 37% in Scotland, we need management measures in those areas. And then at least 10% of that needs to be fully protected. So that would allow for at least 10% to be hopefully rewilded and going forward. But then to also think about the rest of the marine environment in that. So not just that then 30% that you're looking to provide protection to, but the remaining 70% as well. And how do we interact with the marine environment in respect of that remaining area is really important. So considering the whole site and the ecosystem based kind of approach to management in the rest of the marine environment needs to occur in all policy that we take going forward. So the Future of Fisheries Management Strategy announced by Scotland in December 2020 detailed that Scotland would be implementing an ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management going forward. And that's really important to consider the remaining 70% of the marine environment outside of those protected areas, so that nature is placed at the heart of any management decisions that we have there as well. So yeah, I would just like to say that as being really important there too.
Well, let's move on to talk about cost then, because a lot of this is very expensive. It might sound like it's the cheapest option just to kind of return an area to the wild and let it look after itself, but it takes a lot of setting up. Is that a barrier now and in the future to actually trying to carry on this rewilding journey, Pete?
It depends on circumstances. There are areas of Scotland that would rewild quite happily if we just left them alone. There has to be certain factors in place to enable that. In other places, you're quite right, it needs significant intervention and therefore significant cost, significant funding available. So it does depend on the setting, on the context, on the size and on the physicality of the land itself. But there are areas, increasing number of areas, and I live very close to one in the Cairngorms, that effectively all that has changed to allow the land to rewild or for the natural vegetation to recover is a reduction in grazing pressure. Now that was an intensive intervention and expensive intervention at the time, but since then, and we're 15 years on from that action, you know, we've done very, very little, if anything, and the land has just been allowed to recover of its own accord. So it's nature coming back on its own terms, if you like, forging its own path. So it depends on the setting, it depends on people's objectives. Money is needed. I would argue that it's probably really important in the marine environment. But in many cases, it is just a shift in mindset and saying, we're just going to stand back and let nature forge its own path.
Does that bring back, I know you were talking about this not being about turning the clock back, but does it actually then, if you just leave it to look after itself, does that create that multi-layered complex ecosystem? Or do the species, the strongest species, be it plants or wildlife, whatever it is, do they essentially take over? Because, for example, if you look at some of the peatlands that have been subjected to fires, they don't very quickly come back to being rich peatlands. There are one or two species that have essentially take over those lands.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, I think the alternative of letting go is the micromanagement, if you like, that has led us to the situation that we're in. The fact is that conservation in its historical approach has led us to a point where, you know, it's failed to arrest and reverse the decline, the ecological decline that we're now discussing. So, you know, there is no blueprint for rewilding. There is no handbook that says this is right and this is wrong. But I do think we need a much more ambitious and much more hands-off approach to the previous approach to allow natural processes to shape and govern the landscape. But you're right, you know, it's not just a question of letting go. If we had a full suite of species, that would be much easier, but we don't. So, you know, we are rightly or wrongly faced with choices and based on different priorities. Do we introduce X animal to achieve this? Do we introduce Y animal to achieve that? Those are subjective decisions in many cases. But I do think that we're becoming more ecologically educated, more ecologically aware, and we're better informed to make some of those judgments than we were historically. But again, I think it's a flick of a switch in many cases to remove ourselves in the long term, or to see a vision whereby we can remove ourselves and ultimately let natural processes play out.
Feline, is it an expensive business in the marine environment?
Undoubtedly, no, it is. It is one of the most expensive forms of restoration in the short term. But the aim of rewilding, the aim of these restoration projects is always to be creating a habitat that over time becomes self-sustaining. And the reason for restoring them in the first place is that they're degraded and you get much less value out of that habitat now. And I don't only mean monetary value, although there's plenty of studies to suggest that is the case, but also cultural value or biodiversity value, all of which have a value to society, however we view it. So yes, the initial costs are really high. And by initial costs, I don't mean 1 or 2 years, because these restoration projects could take a decade or two to really kick off. Particularly in the marine environment, we don't have this baseline. We don't know what our self-sustaining population looks like yet. There's a lot of science that has to be done to establish what those actual goals look like in the long term. But ultimately, it should be the cheapest form of conservation, because you look to be completely hands-off at some point in time and have those benefits year on year on year with very modest intervention.
Bernadette, expensive in the marine environment?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to build on what's been said, with the marine environment, we've also got to consider the fact that there are so many overlapping activities there as well. So we either have to remove those and maybe consider compensating those, or thinking about where else those activities are moving to. So there's other things to think about, like incentivizing low impact fisheries and the cost involved with doing that. So reducing pressures in that way, as well as just funding restoration projects as well. So there's loads of different layers within the marine environment to think about because of those overlapping of activities.
I think just to finish with, I'll go around all of you briefly and ask you whether you think there's a public appetite for rewilding, or whether it's a kind of niche area that you and we are all very interested in, or so what do you? I'll start with you actually, Bernadette. Is it quite niche?
Yes, I mean it can be quite niche. And
how do we make it less niche then?
Well, I think it's sometimes for us working in a kind of bubble, we can sort of think maybe it is just us. But I do think there is an appetite generally throughout the public for a healthier environment. The benefits that we reap from a healthy environment go way beyond just economics. They provide well-being benefits that are so great to us all, and we've all realised that more throughout the pandemic, I really think, and I hope that then that carries through and that appetite just grows and grows. So.
Pete, is it niche, and is that changing?
I've kind of been involved with this in this space for 20 odd years, and I think it's very quickly in the last few years moved from being niche into it being very much a mainstream conversation. And what really excites me more than anything, getting out of bed in the morning, is that the younger generation in particular have a huge appetite to see ecological restoration ramped up, being more ambitious, bigger, better, and joined up. So I think it was niche, and it's now much, much less so.
Is it becoming less niche, do you think, because with the climate crisis, people are also linking it to the biodiversity crisis that we haven't yet declared, but many people believe is equally important? Is there a link?
Absolutely. I mean, the Scottish Government, which to be fair was one of the first countries in the world to declare a climate emergency, have acknowledged that and the global biodiversity emergency are inextricably linked. There's a little bit of a gap between the rhetoric and actions, to be fair, but there is this growing awareness that the system is not functioning as it should, whether that's climatically, even politically, and certainly ecologically. So there is a growing awareness, a growing appetite, and especially amongst a younger generation, which is hugely exciting.
Feline, has that been your perception as well, that it's becoming less niche?
Yeah, I think in the marine environment, rewilding is still extremely new as a concept, and for that reason, it is niche. I think even restoration in the marine environment is considered quite niche, but that is, in my experience, entirely a result of a lack of knowledge about what these habitats look like and what they can do. And it takes very short conversations with people about what these habitat building organisms are, be they worms or mollusks, that people really want to engage and completely understand the basic principles of an organism building a habitat much like trees do on land, and that being the home to many other species. And it does, like, these concepts aren't new. Maybe thinking about the marine context is, but like I say, that's not a barrier except in terms of reaching people, in terms of outreach. And that conversation is definitely growing in the marine environment. With regards to rewilding specifically, I think we're a little bit further behind again. I think there's still a lot of conversation to be had about what rewilding really means in a marine context, given where we are with regards to protections, which Bernadette gave us a fantastic overview of earlier. But we're definitely headed that way. It's niche, but it won't be soon.
How soon? When do you think it'll become more mainstream?
I think we need to have a clearer understanding of what rewilding looks like in the marine environment so that we can have those conversations. And then it won't take very long. I think those conversations within the marine community about restoration versus, or not versus, but what restoration means as opposed to rewilding, that they're still going on. But as we start to think more about landscape levels, about restoring multiple habitats together as a mosaic, about thinking what those underlying forcing processes are, be they usually land-based things that we could be affecting offshore that are going to allow all of these habitats to potentially prosper together. So things like reducing nutrient loads and runoff, improving water quality, and then allowing those habitats to recover. As soon as we start to be able to illustrate that there are these connections, which I think will happen within the next decade. I mean, the science is going on now, then it's going to become something that people don't just get really excited about, but want to see in an estuary near them.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much indeed for joining the conversation. And we particularly enjoyed the bird song accompanying you in your much more appropriate setting. So thank you very much to you and to all of our guests for taking part in this conversation as part of the Edinburgh Science Festival.